He's a very smart prince. He's a prince who prepares, knowing this time I'd run from him. He spread pitch on the stairs. I was caught unawares, and I thought, well, he cares.
That was from Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods, his subversive take on fairy tales. It was staged at the Lyric Stage Company, which has been presenting a multi-year Sondheim cycle. It concludes with Pacific Overtures, his 1976 show about the friendship between a samurai and a fisherman. Spiros Veloudos, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, Jared.
You're artistic director of Lyric Stage Company and the director of Pacific Overtures. Also, I happen to know a very intense Sondheim fan. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you describe your obsession with Sondheim?
11.
Why?
Well, you know, it's kind of like asking the same question about obsession with Shakespeare. There's so many layers. Depending on how you look at it or from what point of view you want to take, Sondheim can change. I've directed Sweeney Todd 3 times. And twice I did it from Mrs. Lovett's point of view, and then the last time I did it from Sweeney's point of view, and it's a whole different play. So that's why I really enjoy Sondheim. And then on top of it, he's just so brilliant in the way that he uses lyrics, you know, and the rhyming schemes that he comes up with, you know. The one that I always talk about is the one from Assassins, where he rhymes bereft with FDR.
That's why he was standing back so far.
That's why when he aimed, he missed the tar.
Just lucky I was there, or we have been left bereft of FDR.
In terms of the lyrics, what I always go to in the way that he makes things so complicated is in A Little Night Music. Mm-hmm. And Don't You Love Farce?
Right.
I'm not a singer, but I can only imagine how difficult Don't You Love Farce, how difficult that is to sing.
Don't you love farce?
Well, you can ask, you know, a whole lot of singers who have done that, and it is tough.
Does he do that intentionally?
I don't think so. I think his intent always is to help the actor. Because, you know, Sondheim is considered this great composer, but he really writes for actors, for theater. And, you know, a lot of what he says about singing is connected to the actor. I mean, one quote of his that I always use is, the only reason you sing in musical theater is because you have no other way to express yourself.
Well, you've done this, is it 10 times now? This, as you complete this Sondheim cycle that you've done, this will be the 10th show that you've presented?
I mean, the cycle started only like, you know, the commitment to it started 3 years ago. I had done a lot of Sondheim before that. So the total is, I've done all of the major Sondheim pieces except 3. I'm about to do 1 of them. I'm in the process of that.
So Pacific Overtures, and this is the other thing that I just appreciate so much about Sondheim, is that there's a point of view that he develops, a conceit. Mm-hmm. So here, I have to cheat. I have to look at my notes.
That's okay.
You have a Japanese playwright's version of an American musical about the American influence on Japan.
Right.
That's very specific.
Very. And the whole idea of this American musical, that came out of the original production.
We sit inside the screens and contemplate the view.
You know, when you sit down to do your analysis as a director, first thing you kind of sit down and say is, well, who's the protagonist and who's the antagonist? And in Pacific Overtures, you have neither. It's not a human being. It's not a person. You know, Japanese culture is the protagonist, and the antagonist is Western culture. How the American dream is kind of foisted on this culture. And we do that all the time still. You know, it's like we haven't learned as a country that you can't just go into a culture and say, okay, this is what you need to do now. So that's why I wanted to do Pacific Overtures, not as the Japanese version of a Broadway musical, because we're not doing a huge Broadway musical, but kind of going back to what Sondheim said about Pacific Overtures is that less is more.
Well, I was struck by that because he said, his books are such a trove, and he described going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and seeing a Japanese screen that, for the large part, was blank, except for one huge explosive pop of art and painting.
Right.
And that inspired him. So how does less is more work in a musical?
At the Lyric, you have to think about less. The original production had 33 actors in it. My production is going to have 11. And there's a lot of doubling. Less is more is you just have to do the best with what you have, but boil it down to the essence of the show.
I've learned over the years through interviewing artists that if pressed, they usually can't acknowledge which is their favorite project or piece. But Sondheim has said that if pressed, he will acknowledge that his favorite song of those he's written is Someone in a Tree from this show.
Pardon me, I was there.
You were where?
At the treaty house.
At the treaty
there
house.
was a tree.
Which was where?
Very near.
Over here.
Maybe over there, but there were trees then everywhere.
It's the story of when the American delegation and the Japanese delegation got together at this treaty house and hammered out a deal. But no one was in the room other than, the only account of it is from the American side. So the conceit of this is a young boy who is up in a tree watching what was going on. Now, later, as an older man, says, I saw what happened because I was up in this tree. It's a great song.
And throughout this musical, too, he's writing his lyrics as a nod to Japanese tradition as haiku.
A lot of it is in haiku. There's an entire song that's haiku called The Poem.
Rain glistening on the silver birch like my lady's tears. Your turn.
Someone starts a haiku, does it, and then says, your turn. And now you're to take that haiku and change it. And then it's your turn. And so it goes back and forth.
Have you ever worked with or met Sondheim?
Yes. I met him. Never worked with him. But I met him, oddly, at the Washington Sondheim Festival. I was standing out in front of the Watergate Hotel waiting for the valet to bring my car up. And I was on my way driving home. I was with a friend who knew of Stephen Sondheim, knew him pretty well. And he walked up the path from the Kennedy Center with Mia Farrow. When my friend introduced me to Sondheim, he said, "Oh, you're the person that did that production of Assassins in Boston." I said, "Yes, I am." I got a note from him on my 20th anniversary at the theater. I got this. It was so funny. I got this envelope. It was typewritten. I go, "Who?" I said, "Nobody uses typewriters anymore except for Stephen Sondheim." Right. So I opened it up. Here's this little note, just one sentence. "Congratulations on your 20th anniversary. Stephen Sondheim."
Finally, I just want to end by asking about you personally. You lost your leg to type 2 diabetes not long ago. And I've been struck, and everybody knows this because of you always do your curtain speeches. I think you're the biggest star at the Lyric Stage Company, frankly, in my estimation. With apologies to everyone else. I just see how the audience responds to you. But I have been struck in my conversations with you, too, about how you dealt with this and the positivity that you've carried through this.
These are the cards I was dealt. The first thing I said was, I'm not going to look for blame or any of that. I'm just going to move forward. And I had to fight depression, certainly. And the way that I fought it was I said, I'm doing what I call egg timer depressions. It's 3 minutes. Turn the egg timer over. Be depressed for 3 minutes. Rail like crazy. And then after 3 minutes, move on.
Has going through something like that changed the way you work?
Well, you know, a person saw me right after I had lost my leg, and they said, well, how's that going to affect your directing? And I went, I don't direct with my legs. You know, I can sit. It's okay. You know, I direct with, you know, hopefully with my brains and my heart.
And I would imagine that it would affect those things. That's,
you know, is it a little different? Yeah, I'm not going to say it's not. You know, but the work happens, and I'm happy with the work, and you know, hopefully I continue to tell great stories, and you know, as Sondheim says in Sunday in the Park with George, you know, give us more to see, and you know, I have a watch that has that engraved on it, so you know, well, that's what I do.
Thank you for giving us more to see always. Spiro Veloudos, it's always so great to speak with you. Thank you.
Jared, I look forward to these kind of things with you
Oh,
because I have such a good time.